Welcome back to another week's analysis behind the news. I like to be a little different from time to time, and this is no exception. Today, I'm just going to very briefly go through a news item and then get into why it's a problem voting for conservatives in Congress. The news item is the headline that apparently they've arrested some Chechen terrorists who eliminated Putin's political adversary in Moscow. It seems there's always Chechen terrorists when it comes to Putin. He used that as the excuse to invade Chechnya and a number of things. And those who defected out of Russia, journalists, ex-KGB, SFB officers, that sort of thing, said that it was all a plan, a ploy by Putin to give the excuse to do what he wanted to do. Blame it on the Chechens. They're terrorists and they're Muslims, so we'll do that. Now, what they have in store as a result of this assassination, I don't know. Probably more government. Our government uses the same excuse of terrorism for more government all across the scope of Homeland Security. At any rate, let's segue now into why it's a problem to vote for conservatives. Now, let's say this represents the Constitution. This is the whole document. You have a number of politicians who vote for the Constitution. They make it their principle, if you will. I used to know a congressman that said, I always read all of the legislation I vote on. He said, I start out with the title. If the title is unconstitutional, I mark it off as no. If the first sentence is unconstitutional, I mark it off as no. If the first paragraph, or two or three, he says 99% of the legislation that crosses his desk to vote on when he was alive was unconstitutional. So he didn't have to read much. But he voted for the Constitution. Conservatives tend to say they do as well. Now, in the Freedom Index of the New American Magazine, published by the John Birch Society, we have an evaluation of all the senators and all the representatives based on 10 votes each half year on the constitutionality of that issue and whether they voted it up or voted it down. Now, a lot of people don't like that strict look at it, but you know, when you're dealing with the Constitution, let's say that you vote 80% of the time for the Constitution, or using the Constitution as your basis to vote 80% of the time. That means that 20% of the time you don't. So that kind of erodes on the Constitution when you do that. Let's say that you vote for the national debt. I mean, after all, you don't want the government to go out of business. You don't want everything to collapse. You don't want these benefits and welfare checks for these poor children and destitute families to stop. So you vote for this unconstitutional thing. The same way with unconstitutional agencies. For instance, the Department of Education. I mean, after all, it's the children, isn't it? We have to vote for the children, so we vote to fund the Department of Education, completely unconstitutional. And you start adding these things up like the Department of Commerce and things of that nature, you're still voting 80% of the time as you go along. The same way with the Communications Commission. They have no right to regulate the airwaves. That is a freedom of speech thing. That is the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. It's the spirit that is being violated. I mentioned that before a couple of weeks ago. You had freedom of speech and the freedom of the press when the Constitution was written. That's all the forms of communication you had. Ever since then, every one of those things that came along, telegraph, telephone, radio, television, etc., internet now, is unconstitutionally, in the spirit of it, being violated. So you vote 80%, and you want to make sure that the airwaves remain free of people who just come on and want to have a radio station. You got to have some law and order even on the airwaves, right? What about the Environmental Protection Agency? Now, that one was an edict by President Nixon. It isn't just Obama and the Democrats. Richard Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, by executive order. And then, being a good constitutional conservative Republican, You've got to support the president. You don't want to embarrass him. And after all, we need to protect the environment for the future of our children. And so I keep voting 80%. And it goes on and on and on. And then I'm also sitting in the Congress with a number of people. I don't always win all the votes, you see. Sometimes I lose them to the people who vote less than 50% of the Constitution. And so it just keeps eroding and eroding. So ultimately, if those conservatives don't stand up, dig their heels in, and say 100% is how I'm going to vote, they're going to give in more and more to the ones that kind of let it erode or want to erode it completely. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, there are people in Congress that want the Constitution to be completely eroded, even completely rewritten. And those are some of the problems we have with people in this Article 5 business that we're talking about now with a constitutional convention or a convention of the states. Now I want to end up, and I hope I've made the point, that if you keep voting 80%, 75%, or 85% of the time, you look like you're being a good constitutional representative, but you're not. You are constantly eroding it and retarding it until ultimately very little is left. And that's the condition that we see ourselves in today, is that we don't have enough people in the Congress willing to stand up, united, and say, no way, we are not going to vote for any leader, we're not going to vote for any bill, we're not going to vote for any movement that violates the Constitution of the United States, period. That's the criteria we should look at. Now, I'm going to end up on a blatant commercial for this latest trifold that we've got called Does Trade Affect Our Security? This is a very good pamphlet to convince people that our trade policies, as they've been constituted and as they want to move forward, are very dangerous to the national security of the United States. Let me just give you a couple of facts that are pointed out in here to lead you to that conclusion. For one thing, at the beginning of World War II, the United States was the biggest steel producer in the world. Today, that nation is China. They outproduce the rest of the world in steel. Today, ladies and gentlemen, due to our trade policies, 80% of all the components in our weaponry that we produce are produced overseas. In other words, we may even assemble them in the United States, but the components, 80% of them, come from overseas, particularly in our high-tech weaponry, our smart bombs, and things of that nature. Too much of that is manufactured in nations such as China. We cannot even put a large plane in the air today, Boeing, civilian or military, that does not have parts from China and or Russia. And yet those are our two potential enemies in a prolonged world war. We have gotten ourselves, through our trade policies, into a position where today we are putting our men and women in harm's way, and in a prolonged war they will suffer greatly because we have not maintained the industry that we need in this country to have a prolonged war and win it. And so when you just think about the steel alone, you know, we actually gave away billions and billions of dollars of weaponry to our allies in World War II because we had the industry and the economy enabling us to do so. Most people don't know that the Russians defeated the Germans on the Eastern Front because of the trucks, the 2.5-ton trucks we sent over there by the thousands. They would not have been able to move their troops. They would not have been able to maneuver against the panzer divisions of the Nazis if we had not sent them, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20,000 trucks. Those were made out of steel. The engines were made out of steel. The tanks are made out of steel. The ships are made out of steel. The rifles and the guns, they're two different things, by the way, are made out of steel. And so steel is very, very important, and yet we've retarded our steel industry because of our trade program. And you can go on and on with these facts in this little brochure. Very good to use with veterans, with people who are concerned about the security of the United States. And there's more in here. I urge that you all go on jbs.org to shop JBS and order this new brochure. It's very good to show that our free trade, so-called free trade policies, I hate those terms, but those things are killing us. It's killing our economy, and you can't win a war on an agrarian economy. It has to be an industrial economy, and we've been giving our industry away. Until next week, we'll see you then.